The message came through at 05:47 hours on February 23, 1945. Corporal Henry Bake Jr. sat hunched in a foxhole on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, radio handset pressed against his ear, while Japanese artillery screamed overhead. His fingers moved across the encryption pad with practiced efficiency, but he wasn't consulting any code book. The words flowing from his mouth were in Diné Bizad, the Navajo language, transformed into a combat communication system that would baffle enemy cryptographers for the entire duration of World War II. Within 6 hours of that transmission, Marines would plant the American flag atop Mount Suribachi in what would become the war's most iconic photograph. But the story of how that moment became possible began 4 years earlier in a conference room 9,000 miles away with a white civil engineer who had grown up on the Navajo reservation and 29 young Native Americans who would create military history. Philip Johnston sat across from Major General Clayton B. Vogel in early 1942, making what must have seemed like an absurd proposal. Johnston, the son of a Protestant missionary, had spent his childhood on the Navajo reservation and was one of the few non-Navajos who spoke the language fluently. His idea was radical: use Navajo as the basis for an unbreakable military code. The United States military had a desperate problem. Japanese cryptographers had proven devastatingly effective at breaking American codes. In the Pacific Theater, intercepted communications had led to ambushes, compromised operations, and American deaths. Traditional encryption methods, no matter how sophisticated, shared a fatal flaw. They were based on European languages with known grammatical structures and mathematical patterns. Given enough time and intercepted messages, skilled cryptanalysts could crack them. Johnston's insight was that the Navajo language itself could serve as an encryption layer that Japanese codebreakers had no framework to even begin analyzing. The Japanese military had sent students to American universities before the war. They had scholars familiar with European languages, Latin roots, and Western linguistic structures. They had captured American codebooks. They had interrogated prisoners. They had sophisticated frequency analysis techniques. But they had no exposure to Navajo, a language so structurally different from Indo-European languages that linguistic anthropologists classified it in an entirely separate family. Navajo is a tonal language with a syntax that doesn't follow subject-verb-object patterns familiar to English or Japanese speakers. It uses verb conjugations that can create single words expressing what would require entire sentences in English. The language had no written form used by most speakers, no textbooks available to outsiders, and was spoken by fewer than 30,000 people, virtually all living in the American Southwest. Even other Native American tribes couldn't understand it. To Japanese cryptographers, intercepted Navajo transmissions would sound like nothing in their linguistic experience. General Vogel was skeptical, but desperate enough to authorize a demonstration. In May 1942, Johnston arranged for 2 Navajos to participate in a test at Camp Elliott near San Diego. The 2 men were given typical military messages to encode and transmit to each other. They converted English messages to Navajo equivalents, transmitted them, and decoded them back to English. They did this faster than machines could encrypt and decrypt messages using contemporary coding systems. The accuracy was perfect. The speed was remarkable. But the real revelation came when Marine intelligence officers tried to break the code using standard cryptanalysis methods. They failed completely. even when they knew the messages were in Navajo. Even when they brought in the few academic experts on Native American languages available for consultation, they couldn't decipher the system. The demonstration convinced Marine leadership. Within weeks, the Corps approved a pilot program to recruit Navajo speakers for a specialized communications unit. The first 29 recruits reported to Camp Elliott in May 1942, and their names should be recorded with the same reverence afforded to the signers of the Declaration of Independence, because what they created would save thousands of American lives. Carl Gorman from Ganado, Arizona, was 35 years old, making him nearly twice the age of some recruits, but his maturity and artistic skills would prove invaluable. Chester Nez, at 15, the youngest recruit initially rejected for his age but eventually accepted, would later become one of the Code's primary historians. There was John Benally, Samuel Begay, Wilsie Bitsy, Cozy Brown, John Brown Jr., Eugene Crawford, David Curley, Lowell Damon, George Dennison, James Dixon, Carl Gorman, Oscar Ilthma, Jack Jones, Alfred Leonard, Johnny Manuelito, Peter McDonald, who would later become chairman of the Navajo Nation, William McCabe, Chester Nez, Joe Palmer, Charlie Phillips, Nelson Thompson, Harry Sozi, and others whose names were kept classified for decades after the war. These men faced a unique challenge. They weren't simply going to speak Navajo on military radios. That alone would have been inadequate for several reasons. First, the Navajo language lacked words for modern military terminology. There were no traditional Navajo words for tank, bomber, aircraft carrier, or battleship. Second, even if Japanese couldn't understand Navajo, they could potentially capture a Navajo speaker and force him to translate. Third, proper names, place names, and technical terms would still need to be spelled out, creating potential vulnerabilities. The 29 men had to create a code within a language, a two-layer system that would prove cryptographically unbreakable. Over 6 weeks in the summer of 1942, working in a classified environment at Camp Elliott, they built it from scratch. The first decision was to create Navajo equivalents for military terms by using the Navajo practice of descriptive naming. A dive bomber became genie, the Navajo word for chicken hawk, because it dived on its targets like the bird diving on prey. A battleship became lotso, meaning whale, the largest thing in the ocean. A submarine became beshlo, iron fish, something that moved through water but was made of metal. A hand grenade became nimasi, potato, because of its similar size and shape. Fighter planes were da-hee-dee-hi, hummingbirds, reflecting their speed and agility. Bombs were ah-yeshi, eggs, dropped from above. A destroyer became kalo, shark, a predator of the seas. These weren't arbitrary assignments. Each term reflected Navajo cultural understanding and created memorable associations that allowed for rapid encoding and decoding. An aircraft carrier, the largest vessel that carried planes, became Sidi Mafa Yehai, bird carrier. The terms made intuitive sense to Navajo speakers, while remaining impenetrable to anyone else. But military vocabulary was only the first layer. The code also needed an alphabet system for spelling out words that had no Navajo equivalent, proper names, geographic locations, or technical designations. The 29 men created what cryptographers would later recognize as a substitution cipher, but one embedded within a language that itself served as encryption. They assigned Navajo words to each letter of the English alphabet, choosing words whose first letter in English corresponded to the letter they represented. For the letter A, they chose Willachi, ant. For B, shush, bear. For C, moasi, cat. D was B, deer. E was dze, elk. This continued through the alphabet. F as Mei, fox. G as Clizzy, goat. H as Lin, horse. I as Tikin, ice. J as Tekelichogi, jackass. K as Clizzy kid. L as Dibiyazi, lamb. M as Naastsosi, mouse. N as Neshchi, nut. The system's sophistication went further. To prevent frequency analysis, the most common cryptanalysis technique, they assigned multiple Navajo words to frequently used English letters. The letter E, the most common letter in English, had 3 separate Navajo equivalents: Dze, elk; Aja, air; and Ahna, eye. The letter A had 3 options: Wolachi, ant; Belasana, apple; and Seniel, axe. This meant that the same English letter could be represented different ways in different messages, or even within the same message, making frequency analysis useless. If a cryptanalyst tried to chart which Navajo words appeared most frequently, hoping to identify common English letters, they would find frequency distributions that didn't match any known language pattern. It was cryptographic genius, created by men with no formal training in cryptography, most of whom had never finished high school. The original code vocabulary consisted of approximately 200 terms. Each of the 29 men memorized the entire system. No written copies were allowed to leave the training facility. This was itself a security measure, because a code that existed only in the minds of its operators couldn't be captured or stolen. The men drilled constantly, practicing encoding and decoding messages until they could do it at conversational speed. They ran exercises where messages would be passed through multiple operators to ensure consistency. They tested the system's durability under stress, with instructors shouting at them, setting off explosions nearby, and creating chaotic conditions that simulated combat. The code worked flawlessly. After 6 weeks, the Marine Corps had a functional, tested, unbreakable code and 29 trained operators ready for deployment. The Code Talkers shipped out to the Pacific Theater in August 1942, assigned in pairs to Marine divisions preparing for offensive operations. Military leadership remained skeptical. Many officers didn't understand how men speaking what sounded like incomprehensible gibberish could possibly be more effective than established encryption machines. Some commanders refused to use them initially, preferring familiar communication methods despite their proven vulnerabilities. That skepticism evaporated during the Battle of Guadalcanal, which began on August 7, 1942, and would become the code's first major combat test. The Guadalcanal campaign was brutal, a 6-month struggle for control of a strategic island in the Solomon Islands chain. Japanese forces contested every inch of jungle, every ridge, every beach. Communication speed was literally life or death. Artillery coordinates needed to be transmitted instantly to prevent friendly fire. Troop movements required real-time updates. Intelligence about enemy positions had to flow rapidly up the chain of command. Traditional encryption methods created fatal delays. Messages had to be encoded using codebooks or mechanical encryption devices, transmitted, then decoded on the receiving end. The process could take hours for complex messages. Officers made tactical decisions based on information that was already outdated by the time they received it. Japanese forces exploited these delays, moving positions before American artillery could target them, ambushing units whose movements had been radioed in compromised codes. The Code Talkers eliminated these delays entirely. An officer could give a message in English to a code talker who would immediately convert it to coded Navajo and transmit it. On the receiving end, another code talker would hear the Navajo transmission and convert it back to English in real time, handing the decoded message to his commanding officer within seconds. What had taken hours now took minutes or seconds. During the first 48 hours of operations on Guadalcanal, code talkers transmitted more than 800 messages without a single error. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, sent a message to headquarters that simply stated, "The Navajo Code is operational. Recommend expansion." The recommendation was urgent because Vandegrift had witnessed something remarkable. During a Japanese counterattack on the Marine perimeter, code talkers had coordinated artillery fire, called in air support, and directed troop reinforcements faster than had ever been possible before. The Japanese, intercepting these transmissions, had no framework for understanding what they were hearing. Their cryptographers, accustomed to breaking American codes within days or even hours, found themselves confronting something entirely outside their experience. Japanese intelligence reports from Guadalcanal, later captured and translated, described the transmissions as a completely unknown language and noted that attempts at analysis have proven futile. The success triggered a massive expansion. The Marine Corps immediately began recruiting additional Navajos, eventually bringing the total number of code talkers to approximately 420 over the course of the war. The original 29 men became instructors, training new recruits in the code system they had created. The vocabulary expanded to meet operational needs. By 1945, the code contained over 600 terms. New military equipment required new code words. When the M4 Sherman tank entered service, it became Chedagahi Nail Tsaidi, tortoise, reflecting its armored shell and tracked movement. Radar became a SAT, brain, because it allowed forces to see what was beyond visual range. As new terms were added, all code talkers had to memorize the updates, maintaining the system's security by keeping it entirely in human memory rather than written documentation. The expansion also revealed something unexpected about the code talker's effectiveness beyond pure communication speed. The Navajo Marines brought cultural attributes that proved tactically valuable. Navajo culture emphasized mental discipline, patience, and the importance of precise communication. Traditional Navajo education relied heavily on exact memorization of complex oral histories, ceremonial songs, and genealogies. This cultural background meant code talkers possessed extraordinary memory capabilities and attention to detail. They rarely made transmission errors, even under extreme combat stress. They could remember message content even if radio equipment failed mid-transmission. Several commanders noted in after-action reports that their code talkers demonstrated unusual composure under fire, a quality that Navajo veterans later attributed to cultural values that emphasized maintaining inner balance regardless of external chaos. The code underwent its most severe test during the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943. Tarawa was a coral atoll with strategic importance, defended by 4,800 Japanese troops in heavily fortified positions. The Americans expected a difficult fight, but underestimated the challenge. The invasion fleet arrived during an unexpected low tide, forcing landing craft to stop at the reef, far from the beach. Marines had to wade hundreds of yards through chest-deep water, while Japanese machine guns and artillery tore through their ranks. It became one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history. Radio communications became absolutely critical because the chaotic landing meant units were scattered, command structure was disrupted, and officers were trying to coordinate attacks on fortified positions while under intense fire. Code talkers worked continuously for 76 hours during the Tarawa assault, transmitting and receiving messages while their positions were under constant attack. They sat in shell holes and behind destroyed landing craft, radios balanced on their knees, converting English to Navajo code and back again while Japanese snipers specifically targeted radio operators, recognizing that disrupting communications could collapse American coordination. Several code talkers were wounded during Tarawa operations, but continued transmitting until relieved or until their injuries made it physically impossible to operate equipment. Private First Class Henry Bake Jr., who would later transmit crucial messages during Iwo Jima, received shrapnel wounds at Tarawa, but refused evacuation until his replacement arrived, fearing that communication gaps would endanger his unit. Japanese desperation to understand the code became apparent at Tarawa. Captured documents revealed that Japanese intelligence had distributed recordings of intercepted radio transmissions to cryptanalysis units throughout the Pacific, offering rewards for anyone who could identify the language or break the code. Japanese forces captured radios and communication equipment, trying to understand the American system. They interrogated captured Marines about radio procedures. They recruited every available linguist. They consulted with Japanese academics who had studied indigenous American cultures. They even questioned Japanese Americans who had lived in the southwestern United States before the war, hoping someone might have encountered the language. Every effort failed. The captured documents showed increasing frustration, with one Japanese intelligence officer writing that the American code appeared to be a language unknown to our linguists and possibly artificially constructed for military use. The Japanese theory about an artificial language was actually a complement to the code's effectiveness. Cryptographers know that artificial languages designed for encryption can be extremely difficult to break if properly constructed, but they usually sacrifice communication speed because operators must learn an entirely unnatural system. The Navajo Code achieved something cryptographically remarkable. It combined the confusion value of an artificial code with the speed and fluency of a natural language. Code talkers were communicating in a real language they had spoken since childhood, giving them natural fluency. But the military terminology layer created substitutions that functioned like an artificial code. Even if a Japanese cryptanalyst somehow learned basic Navajo, which was nearly impossible given the language's isolation, they would still face the code layer where whale meant battleship and chicken hawk meant dive bomber. By 1944, code talkers were standard elements in Marine operations, and their reputation had spread throughout the Pacific command structure. Commanders specifically requested code talkers for their operations. The men worked in what cryptographers call a high-tempo communications environment, meaning they transmitted messages continuously during combat operations, sometimes for days without sleep, maintaining accuracy under conditions that would cause most encryption systems to fail. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Forces, stated in a communication to Marine headquarters that the Navajo Code is the only code in modern warfare that has never been broken. This wasn't public relations exaggeration. It was operational fact, verified by intelligence assessments, prisoner interrogations, and captured enemy documents. The code's security came from multiple layers working together. First, Navajo itself was incomprehensible to Japanese cryptanalysts, providing what cryptographers call linguistic confusion. Second, the substitution system for military terms created a semantic layer where even common Navajo words meant something different in code context. Third, the multiple equivalents for common letters prevented frequency analysis. Fourth, the lack of written materials meant there was nothing to capture or steal. Fifth, the small number of fluent Navajo speakers worldwide meant Japanese forces couldn't recruit translators. These layers combined to create what NSA analysts would later describe in declassified reports as the only unbroken code in modern military history, a system that achieved what mechanical encryption devices and mathematical algorithms could not: absolute security in operational use. The human element created one additional security feature that designers of mechanical encryption systems couldn't replicate. Code talkers knew each other, often recognized each other's voices on the radio, and developed informal authentication methods. If an operator heard something that seemed slightly off in phrasing or accent, they would challenge the transmission with questions that only a genuine Navajo would understand, sometimes asking about reservation geography or cultural practices. This made it virtually impossible for Japanese forces to plant fake operators, even if they somehow captured and turned a code talker, a scenario that never occurred but that military planners had considered. The code's security ultimately rested not just in its linguistic sophistication, but in the community of men who operated it, men who shared cultural knowledge that outsiders couldn't fake. The strategic importance of the code talkers reached its apex during the Battle of Iwo Jima, which began on February 19, 1945, and would become the largest all-Marine battle in history. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock, strategically positioned between the Mariana Islands and the Japanese mainland. American planners needed it as an emergency landing site for B-29 bombers flying missions against Japan and as a base for fighter escorts. Japanese commanders understood its importance equally well and had spent months transforming the island into perhaps the most heavily fortified position in military history. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded 21,000 troops dug into 11 miles of underground tunnels, reinforced bunkers, and concealed artillery positions. He had studied American tactics and knew that the Marines relied heavily on radio communications to coordinate their combined arms approach, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Kuribayashi's defensive strategy specifically targeted American communication systems. Japanese forces had orders to prioritize killing radio operators, destroying communication equipment, and disrupting American command and control. The general believed, correctly, that if he could blind and deafen the American command structure, the numerical superiority and firepower advantages would diminish significantly. What Kuribayashi didn't know was that the communication system he planned to disrupt was fundamentally different from anything Japanese forces had encountered before. 6 Navajo Code Talkers landed with the first assault waves on Iwo Jima on February 19th. Within the first 2 days of fighting, as Marines struggled to advance across the island's black sand beaches under devastating fire from concealed positions, those 6 men and the others who came ashore in subsequent waves transmitted more than 800 messages coordinating artillery strikes, naval gunfire, air support requests, casualty evacuations, ammunition resupply, and tactical movements. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer at Iwo Jima, would later state in an interview declassified by the NSA in 1968 that, without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. This wasn't hyperbole. Connor had direct oversight of all division communications and could compare the performance of different communication methods under identical combat conditions. He observed that conventional encryption methods created delays that proved catastrophic in the fluid combat environment of Iwo Jima. Japanese defensive positions were expertly camouflaged and mutually supporting. American units advancing across open ground needed immediate fire support to suppress these positions. Delays of even 10 or 15 minutes in calling for artillery or airstrikes gave Japanese defenders time to inflict casualties and potentially stop American advances. The Code Talkers eliminated these delays entirely, allowing near instantaneous communication between forward observers, fire control centers, and support units. The battle's most famous moment, the flag raising on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, was made possible in part by Code Talker communications. The assault on Suribachi, a 556-foot volcanic cone dominating the southern portion of the island, required precise coordination between multiple Marine companies, supporting artillery from both land-based batteries and naval vessels, and air cover to suppress Japanese positions on the mountain slopes and at its base. Corporal Henry Bake Jr. and Private First Class George Kirk were the Code Talkers assigned to the units assaulting Suribachi. For 3 days prior to the final assault, they transmitted targeting data for the preparatory bombardment, coordinated the movement of flamethrower teams and demolition squads tasked with reducing Japanese bunkers, and maintained communication between assault units and command posts. On the morning of February 23rd, as a 40-man patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines began climbing Suribachi. Bake transmitted updates on their progress every few minutes. The patrol expected fierce resistance. Instead, they found that the intensive bombardment, much of it directed by Code Talker transmissions over the previous 72 hours, had killed or trapped most of the Japanese defenders in collapsed tunnels. At 10:20 hours, the patrol reached the summit and raised a small American flag. Bake transmitted the message in Navajo Code: "Suribachi taken, flag raised." Within minutes, that message reached command posts throughout the invasion force and was relayed to ships offshore. The flag raising, photographed by Joe Rosenthal in what would become the most reproduced image in photographic history, represented more than a symbolic victory. Suribachi's capture eliminated Japanese observation posts that had directed artillery fire on the beaches, significantly improving the tactical situation for Marines still coming ashore and for supply operations. The speed with which this tactical advantage was communicated and exploited owed directly to the Code Talkers' ability to transmit information faster than any alternative system. But Iwo Jima's fighting continued for another month after Suribachi fell, and the Code Talkers worked continuously throughout. The island's northern sector contained the most elaborate defensive positions, including the main network of underground tunnels where General Kuribayashi had his headquarters. Fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat as Marines used flamethrowers, explosives, and small arms to clear hundreds of bunkers and tunnel entrances. Communication became even more critical because units were often separated by only a few hundred yards, but couldn't see each other due to the terrain's rough volcanic surface. Friendly fire became a constant danger. Artillery needed exact coordinates to avoid hitting American positions. Airstrikes required precise timing to avoid catching Marines in open ground. The code talkers provided the communication accuracy that made this coordination possible. Declassified battle reports show that communication errors caused friendly fire incidents in several Pacific battles where code talkers weren't available. But Iwo Jima's after-action reports contain no significant friendly fire casualties attributed to communication failures. The physical demands on code talkers during Iwo Jima were extraordinary. They carried radio equipment weighing up to 80 pounds while moving with assault units across difficult terrain under fire. They worked in shifts lasting 18 to 20 hours, catching sleep in foxholes between transmissions. They operated equipment damaged by shrapnel, sometimes holding broken components together while transmitting. Private First Class Jack Nez, brother of Chester Nez, operated his radio for 36 consecutive hours during critical fighting in the northern sector, surviving on cold rations and water, transmitting hundreds of messages while his position was under intermittent mortar fire. When his radio was damaged by shrapnel, he field repaired it using wire from a destroyed Japanese communication line and continued operations. His commanding officer recommended him for a commendation, but like virtually all code talker contributions, this wasn't publicized because their work remained classified. The classification created a peculiar situation. Code talkers were performing work that clearly merited recognition and commendation, but acknowledging their contributions would require explaining what they did, which would compromise the code's security. Military leadership decided that maintaining operational security was more important than public recognition. Code talkers received combat decorations for bravery under fire, for heroic actions that could be described without referencing their communication work, but their primary contribution remained secret. This meant that even after Iwo Jima, even after their work had proven decisive in the Pacific's bloodiest battles, the code talkers remained unknown to the American public and to military historians documenting the war. They appeared in unit rosters simply as radio operators, a bland designation that concealed their unique role. Japanese forces never broke the code, but not for lack of trying. Captured documents from Iwo Jima included multiple intelligence reports describing American radio transmissions as incomprehensible and noting that cryptanalysis had failed. One particularly telling document, a report from a Japanese signals intelligence unit to Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, described monitoring American communications throughout the Iwo Jima operation and noted that the enemy is using a communication method we cannot decipher. The language is unlike any we have studied. We do not believe it is a machine cipher. It appears to be a human language, but not English, not Chinese, not any Philippine dialect, and not any indigenous language we have encountered in the Pacific. We have no method to approach this problem. The report recommended capturing American radio operators for interrogation, but also noted that previous attempts to capture such operators had failed because these radio men fight with exceptional determination and their units protect them carefully. The Japanese observation about code talkers fighting with determination was accurate. Several code talkers engaged in direct combat when their positions were overrun, or when they accompanied assault units into close quarters fighting. They understood that they couldn't allow themselves to be captured because interrogation might compromise the code. Marine commanders understood this as well, and often assigned additional security to protect code talkers. though this protection couldn't always prevent casualties. At least 13 code talkers were killed in action during the Pacific War, and many more were wounded. Their deaths created operational problems beyond the personal tragedy because each code talker represented an irreplaceable asset. Unlike conventional radio men, who could be replaced by any trained operator, code talkers required specific linguistic and cultural backgrounds that couldn't be rapidly recreated through training. The Battle of Okinawa, which began in April 1945 and continued until June, provided the final major combat test of the code. Okinawa was larger than Iwo Jima, more heavily defended, and closer to the Japanese home islands, making it even more strategically critical. The Japanese committed over 100,000 troops to Okinawa's defense and launched massive kamikaze attacks against the American fleet supporting the invasion. The 82-day battle became the war's largest Pacific campaign. Code talkers worked throughout the operation, transmitting an estimated 15,000 messages without a single decrypt by Japanese intelligence. By Okinawa, the code had expanded to over 800 terms, incorporating new equipment, tactics, and operational concepts that had emerged during 3 years of Pacific combat. The system had evolved from the original 200 terms created by the 29 men at Camp Elliott to a comprehensive military communication system, all maintained through memorization by the code talkers themselves. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation that would have involved the largest amphibious assault in history and would have relied heavily on code talker communications. Military planners had projected casualties in the hundreds of thousands for the Japan invasion, and they had requested additional Navajo recruits to support the communication demands. The war's sudden end meant those projections were never tested, but it also meant that the code talkers' contribution remained classified. The Marine Corps ordered all code talkers to maintain absolute secrecy about their work. They were told that the code might be needed in future conflicts and that any disclosure could compromise national security. This classification would remain in effect for 23 years until 1968, when the military finally declassified the Navajo Code program. The secrecy created profound difficulties for the code talkers returning to civilian life. They had participated in some of the war's most significant battles, had performed work that senior commanders credited with saving thousands of lives, but they couldn't discuss any of it. When they returned to the Navajo reservation or settled in cities, they couldn't explain their military service beyond generic descriptions of being radio men. Family members who asked about their war experiences received evasive answers. Communities that held ceremonies honoring returning veterans couldn't properly recognize the code talkers because the men couldn't describe what they had actually done. This silence was particularly difficult within Navajo culture, which traditionally honored warriors and expected them to share their experiences through oral history. The code talkers had to violate this cultural expectation because of military security requirements. The psychological impact of this enforced silence was significant. Several code talkers later described feeling isolated, unable to process their combat experiences because they couldn't talk about the specific work that had defined their wartime service. Some struggled with what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by the inability to seek counseling or support, because doing so would require discussing classified information. Many code talkers returned to the Navajo reservation, where economic opportunities were limited and where the Bureau of Indian Affairs still maintained policies that undermined Navajo culture and language. The men who had used their native language to serve their country returned to a society that still operated boarding schools, designed to eliminate Native American languages and cultural practices. The irony was bitter and occasionally overwhelming. The 1968 Declassification began changing this situation, though slowly. The Marine Corps released basic information about the Code Talker program and acknowledged that Navajo Marines had operated an unbroken code during World War II. The announcement received limited media attention, partly because 1968 was dominated by Vietnam War news, civil rights struggles, and political upheaval. The Code Talker's story didn't fit neatly into contemporary narratives about World War II, which had been told primarily through European theater experiences and which rarely emphasized Native American contributions. Some historians began researching the program, interviewing code talkers who were now willing to discuss their experiences and documenting details that had been lost to official records because so much of the code had existed only in human memory. Academic interest in the code revealed its cryptographic sophistication. Linguists and cryptographers analyzing the system recognized that the 29 original code talkers had independently invented techniques that professional cryptographers had spent decades developing. The use of multiple equivalents for common letters to defeat frequency analysis was a standard cryptographic practice, but the code talkers had implemented it without formal training in cryptanalysis. The creation of a specialized vocabulary using descriptive metaphors showed sophisticated understanding of how to create memorable codes that could be rapidly used under stress. The decision to maintain the code through memorization, rather than written materials, demonstrated security consciousness that impressed professional intelligence officers. Dr. William C. Meadows, an anthropologist who extensively studied the code talkers and published multiple academic works on the subject, wrote that the Navajo Code represented a unique synthesis of linguistic anthropology, indigenous cultural knowledge, and practical cryptography, unlike anything else in military history. The National Security Agency, America's premier signals intelligence organization, conducted its own analysis of the Navajo Code in the 1970s and concluded that it would have been effectively unbreakable even with modern computational cryptanalysis methods. NSA's analysis noted that the code's security came not from mathematical complexity, but from linguistic obscurity combined with a substitution layer. A computer with sufficient processing power could theoretically break a mathematical code by testing billions of potential keys, but the Navajo Code didn't have a mathematical key to attack. The linguistic foundation meant that breaking it required first identifying the base language from among thousands of human languages, then learning that language well enough to understand military context, then decoding the substitution layer. NSA analysts calculated that even with computers and linguistic databases, this process would take months or years, making the code effectively unbreakable for tactical military use, where intelligence loses value within hours or days. The Japanese perspective on the code began emerging in the 1980s as historians interviewed Japanese veterans and examined captured archives more thoroughly. Japanese military intelligence officers who had worked on American code breaking during the war confirmed that the Navajo transmissions had been incomprehensible. Some Japanese veterans expressed respect for the American ingenuity in developing such a system, noting that Japanese military culture had emphasized technological and tactical innovation, but had overlooked the potential of linguistic security. Several former Japanese cryptographers stated in interviews that they had assumed all valuable military communications would be encoded using machine ciphers or mathematical codes, and they had focused their cryptanalysis efforts accordingly. The possibility that Americans would use an obscure, indigenous language as a code foundation had never occurred to Japanese intelligence planners, representing what military analysts call a cognitive blind spot created by cultural assumptions. Recognition for the code talkers gradually increased during the 1980s and 1990s. The Navajo Nation held ceremonies honoring the men. Museums began featuring exhibits about the program. Documentary filmmakers produced films telling the story. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan declared August 14th as National Code Talkers Day, creating official recognition for the program's contribution. In 2000, President Bill Clinton signed legislation awarding congressional gold medals to the original 29 code talkers and congressional silver medals to all other code talkers. The ceremony held in the Capitol Rotunda in 2001 brought widespread public attention to the program for the first time, more than 50 years after the code had helped win the Pacific War. By this time, many code talkers had died, but surviving members attended the ceremony and finally received public recognition for their service. The code talkers' legacy extends beyond their specific wartime contribution. Their story challenged common narratives about Native Americans in the 20th century, narratives that often portrayed indigenous peoples as victims of historical forces rather than active participants in shaping history. The code talkers were both. They came from communities that had experienced cultural suppression and economic marginalization, yet they used their cultural heritage and indigenous language to make critical contributions to American military victory. This complexity makes their story particularly important for understanding the Native American experience in modern America. They demonstrated that indigenous cultural preservation wasn't incompatible with American patriotism, that native languages had practical value beyond cultural significance, and that Native Americans could serve with distinction while maintaining their distinct identities. The military applications of indigenous languages didn't end with the Navajo Code. During World War II, the military also recruited code talkers from other tribes, including Comanche, Choctaw, Lakota, Meskwaki, and Hopi. Though these programs were smaller and less extensively documented than the Navajo program, the success of these initiatives influenced later military communication security planning. During the Cold War, military planners studied whether similar linguistic approaches could provide secure communications, though advances in electronic encryption ultimately made language-based codes less critical. However, the fundamental principle that the code talkers demonstrated remains relevant. Sometimes, security comes not from technological complexity, but from exploiting knowledge gaps that adversaries cannot easily overcome. The individual stories of code talkers reveal the human dimension behind the statistics and strategic analyses. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, lived until 2014, spending his later years speaking at schools and military installations about his experiences. He described the code development process as feeling like creating something that belonged to us, to Navajos, but that would help everyone. Carl Gorman, another of the original 29, became a noted artist after the war, teaching at the University of California, Davis, and using his artwork to document Navajo culture and code talker experiences. His son, Carl Nelson Gorman, served as a Marine officer in Vietnam, creating a family legacy of military service. Peter MacDonald became chairman of the Navajo Nation, serving from 1970 to 1982, and again from 1987 to 1989, demonstrating how code talkers went on to leadership roles in their communities after military service ended. The physical toll of combat affected many code talkers throughout their lives. Several were wounded multiple times during Pacific campaigns. Some carried shrapnel in their bodies for decades after the war. Many experienced hearing loss from constant exposure to radio equipment and artillery fire. The psychological impact of combat manifested differently across individuals, but interviews with code talkers and their families reveal common themes: pride in their service, satisfaction in having contributed to victory, but also lasting effects from witnessing combat's brutality and from carrying memories they couldn't discuss for decades. Traditional Navajo healing ceremonies played important roles in helping some code talkers process their combat experiences, blending indigenous spiritual practices with the need to address modern psychological trauma. The code talker's story has entered American popular culture through films, books, and educational curricula, though this popularization has sometimes simplified or romanticized a more complex reality. The 2002 film Wind Talkers brought widespread attention to the code talkers, but took significant dramatic liberties with historical facts. Educators have incorporated code talker stories into curricula teaching about World War II, Native American history, and cryptography, ensuring that new generations learn about this contribution. The Navajo Nation has established museums and educational programs dedicated to preserving code talker history and honoring the men who served. These efforts ensure that the story remains accessible and that the code talker's contribution is properly contextualized within both military history and Native American history. As of 2024, very few code talkers remain alive, and the youngest are approaching 100 years old. Their passing makes historical preservation increasingly urgent. Oral history projects have recorded hundreds of hours of interviews with code talkers, capturing their first-hand accounts before they're lost. These recordings provide invaluable primary sources for historians, linguists, and educators. They also serve a cultural preservation function, documenting the Navajo language as it was spoken by a generation that grew up before significant English influence, making these recordings linguistically valuable beyond their historical content. The code talkers spoke Navajo in its most traditional forms, and their recorded voices preserve linguistic features that are disappearing as younger generations speak Navajo influenced by decades of English immersion. The final assessment of the code talkers' contribution must acknowledge both their specific tactical impact and their broader symbolic significance. Tactically, they provided the Pacific Theater with a communication system that was faster than encryption machines, more secure than any code the Japanese could break, and reliable enough to work continuously throughout the war's most intensive combat operations. Major General Clayton B. Vogel, who authorized the original pilot program, later stated that approving the Code Talker program was the single most important decision I made regarding communication security during my military career. Admiral Chester Nimitz's assessment that the code was never broken has been repeatedly confirmed by Japanese sources and American cryptographic analysis. The specific claim that the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima without the Code Talkers is impossible to prove conclusively, but it reflects the judgment of officers who directly commanded those operations and who understood the tactical importance of communication speed and security. Symbolically, the Code Talkers demonstrated that marginalized communities could make unique contributions to national defense, that indigenous languages had practical value in the modern world, and that cultural diversity represented strategic strength rather than weakness. These lessons remain relevant decades after World War II ended. In an era when the United States continues grappling with questions about cultural assimilation, indigenous rights, and the value of linguistic diversity, the Code Talkers provide a historical example of how preserving cultural distinctiveness can serve broader societal interests. They didn't abandon their identity to serve their country. Instead, they served their country precisely because of their identity, using the language and cultural knowledge that made them distinctively Navajo to achieve something no one else could have accomplished. That paradox, that synthesis of particular identity and universal contribution, makes their story not just a footnote to World War II history, but a significant chapter in understanding how diverse societies can harness difference as strength.